Judge, before I move on to my contentions, I would like to talk about today's world or the status quo. In today's world, adaptations exist on a spectrum, and while many films still aim to remain faithful to their very source material, there is an already growing trend of changing novels during adaptation. And this is especially common with classic literature, where there are many older works containing outdated stereotypes, prejudice, sexism, or social norms that the modern audiences do not accept. For example, if we take a look at Disney princess movies, a lot of their books contain the damsel in distress, or a princess that has to be saved by the prince or a knight in order to live their happily ever after. Our side believes that the society instead needs to fix these social outdated social norms that were in the past to creatively reinterpret novels, and the filmmakers or other adaptators would have greater freedom to produce
Point.
the works that are artistically stronger, culturally relevant, and better suited to the film medium. Now I will move on to my first contention. My first contention is that adaptations will prevent a culture that normalizes prejudice or stereotypes. Many classic novels were written during periods when racism, sexism, or other forms of discrimination were considered socially acceptable. And as a result, these ideas were often embedded into the story. And this is not necessarily because the author was mean or rude, but it was just because it reflected the values of their time.
Point.
For example, if we take a look at Snow White is portrayed as a girl that is 14 years old, but yet she still marries in a prince and she is saved in the end of her story. She is placed in a stepmom's castle, which she is very mean to her daughter. And in the end, she gets saved by kissing a prince. And children are especially vulnerable because they look at these films and look at these novels. And this is much more accessible, and films are much more accessible than these novels. And many young people will watch the adaptation long before they ever read the original book, which is made like 50, 100 years ago. And the media consumed during childhood would strongly shape their understanding of gender roles,
Point.
race, and other social norms. The earlier these beliefs are formed, the more likely they are to persist into adulthood. And not just children, but we can also look at minor communities, such as Native Americans or people of color. For example, in Pocahontas, Native Americans are portrayed as
Point.
someone that is vicious and does not know how to speak and does not know how to communicate and understand the feelings of others. Instead, they are just portrayed as someone that is vicious and someone that is just violent and bloodthirsty. And not just this, but there are also many other prejudice and stereotypes that are placed against the people of color or Native people inside Disney or other long time ago novels. And this, portraying the people that are of color or of a certain ethnicity or just any type of minor communities to act or look a certain way could be offensive, and it would offend minor communities. Under our world, experimental adaptations have the freedom to update these portrayals. A princess can become an active protagonist rather than someone that is just waiting to be rescued or what we call a damsel in distress. And minority characters can also be given complexity and agency instead of just existing as stereotypes. We can portray them as actual human beings that we can actually envision and someone that we can actually connect to rather than just some type of stereotype or an image that someone created. More importantly, when audiences notice these differences, they can become curious about the changes they were made.
Point of
They will
information.
compare the adaptation, yes?
Is the theme of empathy delivered through To Kill a Mockingbird appropriate in modern contexts?
Could you repeat that one more time, please?
Is the theme of empathy as delivered through To Kill a Mockingbird appropriate for modern contexts?
Rather than just focusing on one book, what we are saying is that there are so many other novels that have themes, or they have characters, or they have the details that are not really meant for the common, and or not really meant for now. And moving on. The original novel, if we look at the original novel and the audience looks at the original novel and also the adaptation, they can compare these two. And then this can transform the adaptation from simply just preserving old ideas into encouraging a critical reflection on why these ideas should no longer be accepted in the first place. People can see these if we do the experimental adaptation, then people will research for what is different in the film compared to the original. And then they will be able to realize the importance of condemning prejudice and stereotypes because they can see what was stereotypical back at that time. And our world will allow society to preserve classic literature while also ensuring that modern cultural products reinforce equality rather than prejudice and stereotypes during that time. Now, moving on to my second contention, which is experimental adaptations can create spaces for marginalized voices and it can also keep stories culturally relevant. And the purpose of making a new adaptation should not simply to recreate something exactly the same or something that already exists. If audience wants to look at the original story that was written, then they can read the original novel. An adaptation should justify its existence by contributing or adding something new to the original novel. Experimental adaptations allow directors to reinterpret the stories through modern cultural values, and they can also center perspectives that were ignored or silenced. They can look at different perspectives or they can take on different themes within the original novel as well. And these adaptations are not trying to erase the original work, but they're trying to exist by them. The government side is not arguing that we should erase the original version and just create something completely new so no one ever cares about the original. What we are saying is that we should have different versions. And the original novel will remain available for anyone who wishes to experience the author's original vision, while the adaptation exists for a separate artistic interpretation that can also reflect the values of today's society. And this creates a more inclusive film industry, and it can also give minority communities meaningful representation instead of tokenism or instead of prejudice. And it can also ensure that classic stories continue to remain relevant for new audiences and new perspectives and new themes instead of just becoming increasingly disconnected from the modern society. And for all of these reasons, we are proud to propose. Thank you.
Adjudicator. The issue with experimental adaptations is that classic literature has very deep messages with often very important critiques on society and people. When movie studios make experimental adaptations, they often sterilize or oversimplify the original message so much so that they become quite redundant as adaptations. We give you the example of Animal Farm, very recent adaptation which completely sterilized the original plot. To appeal to a mainstream audience. Sure, you may get more people out to watch these films. However, that was completely redundant as the whole point, the whole benefit of these films being adaptations of classics was that you had incredibly deep, meaningful stories. That is why they are classics in the first place. More people, on our side, we get more people to understand the messages of these stories on oppose. A few points of setup. Firstly, why people don't read these books in the first place. I think it's very simple. It's that people don't like to read. These are old books. They are very hard to read and very long. People are not reading Dracula. People are not reading Blood Meridian. People are often not reading Animal Farm. They're not reading Frankenstein. In an increasingly digital world, we see that there is less room for these old texts to exist, which means that everything that prop tries to push you at first about how, people can go read the books if they want to read the books, but then you can also have this artistic expression is often very wrong because the target of these movies particularly are going to be particularly against reading because the people who would be for reading have probably already read these classics because they are classics. They're very well-known books. For example, you have Jane Austen. You have Jane Austen's. You have things like Frankenstein and Macbeth, all of this stuff. So the fact that I'll take you in a second. The fact of the matter is that because these movies target a separate audience, there are some people who are basically only going to be able to experience the message of these books through this movie. I'll take you.
Doesn't adaptations better help the new audience understand the
Okay.
original methods of classical preservations? For
Okay.
instance, by changing Shakespeare's language to modern language, we can help the understanding of the newer generation.
Okay, two things. Firstly, observe that you remove a lot of the historical pretext and a lot of the actual critique that is happening within these movies when you try to modernize them. For example, in Shakespeare, when you change the language and try to modernize it, you lose a lot of the language. But also note that that's not really an experimental adaptation because you're not really doing anything there. You're just sort of adapting the work but translating it to modern English, right? We see that things this moves on to the second point of center, which is why experimental adaptations are likely to be bad. Three reasons for this. Firstly, note that executives just want them to be mainstream for money. They're going to oversimplify it or modernize it. For example, we give you the story of Romeo and Juliet, which has become a romance story because of movies throughout the 90s, 2000s, rather than being about class divide, which is its original message. The second thing is that these stories are often incredibly political, like Romeo and Juliet, like 1984, like Animal Farm. But out of fear of being like overly political, we see that movie executives have a very huge incentive to simplify and degrade these stories into basically just like you're only using these stories as a base because know you are going to be able to fill movie cinema seats because like they are well-known stories, and that's about it. There's not really much, like you're not really paying much homage to the original story. The third thing is that in cases where directors are given creative control, this is the only other world that we see here. We note that they have an incentive to make these movies distinct through a change in the genre or like storytelling. Think Frankenstein or Macbeth being dramatically shifted in their message, tone, and genre. This analysis should tell you that in all cases, there is an incentive to shift the original message. We remove this. So, a few points of extraneous rebuttal. Firstly, so Prop tries to push like this focus on like fairy tales, Disney princesses, stories with like racial and gender stereotypes. Three lines of response to this. Firstly, note that we just explained that directors and executives have an incentive to change significantly more than just this. Secondly, we note that the extent of the harm that they're claiming is probably quite minor. At best, these racial or gender stereotypes probably don't do much, because observe that modern contexts create a majority of media which promote women and minorities. These are often like a very small percentage of stories which are being like shown in cinemas are going to be these like adaptations. So I don't think like saying that like, oh, you go and watch Pocahontas and you see like Native Americans being portrayed in like as like savages. I don't think you like believe that or take that to heart. And I don't think that like even if you did do that, that does much for you and like life, right? Like I don't think that does much. The third thing is that oftentimes like the sorts of things that they're talking about are quite integral to the plot. And so like losing them is a harm in of itself. One point of substantive in this debate, which is you get the message of these originals and you get it to spread to more people. Firstly, why are these messages good? Three reasons here. Firstly, they are often very timeless. 1984, Animal Farm, Frankenstein, they apply to any and all political, socio-economic contexts, especially in an increasingly
Point.
authoritarian world. I'll take you in a second. Secondly, they're often like written for the message out of passion. We give you the example of Jane Austen. Thirdly, we think that they trigger people to think very deeply about the world, to critically think. And what happens? Yeah, I'll take you now.
So you continuously stated that the directors are not only changing the discriminatory parts of the classic novel. Then if you were to only remove the discriminatory parts of the classic novel, then would you agree that the adaptations are
Yes, but
necessary?
that's not what's happening, because directors have an incentive to make their work distinct so that it stands out from the original, because they have an incentive, they want to stand apart from it. Because like you said, they don't want to I think it's like quite the opposite of what you said. They do want to replace it. They want to stand like alongside. It wants to be very separate. But when people are only viewing that separate thing, they don't get to experience the original, which is often where the actual message comes from. So, next line of thinking, what happens when you experimentally adapt? Three layers here. Firstly, you lose the original message. The changing of plot and characters and setting. It all means that at the very least, you're going to get the wrong message. What does this mean? It means you're going to get the wrong discourse being pushed throughout society about this. It means that discussion about like the political context of like Animal Farm didn't happen when the new Animal Farm movie came out, because it sucked. And it was like made for kids. It was very sterile. It was over dramatized. It was oversimplified. You lose all that political meaning. We see this occur again and again. Second thing, is people become more unwilling to engage with the original novel because you have a bad experience with this story. You're significantly less likely to want to pursue the original story. For example, if you like watch Animal Farm and you think, and like the types of people who would watch that movie without having read the book beforehand, or like going and wanting to read the book after, these are the types of people who would probably take that at face value and be like, yeah, it's pretty similar to the story. I don't really need to like read the book now, even though it's like very like you lose a lot of the like the value of it. So there's not like you're less likely to go actually and pursue that. The last thing is that the legacy of writers, we see that is like pretty much destroyed. Like the classic, as we see that like as classics fall out of copyright, you get a manipulation like that. That's a harm in of itself. The impacts of this simple. You just get people to critically think and meaningfully engage with these stories. Are proud to oppose.
We agree on the fact that classic literature contains a lot of meaningful ideas, but due to time frame constraints, it is also true that classics also include racist and sexist issues. We also want to contain the meaningful ideas, but what we're going to do is we're going to match these classics that are matching to the modern society so that these messages are better explained, better transmitted to the audiences. Proud to propose. Few rebuttals before we deliberate our last argument. First of all, they talk about how we oversimplify the context, but this is not the issue of experimental adaptation. Any adaptation, even faithful ones, which is their world, inevitably cuts contents because books and films function differently. A 500-page novel cannot fully fit into a 2-hour movie. This means that even if the adaptation are faithful, for example, let's say just like in the motion, the true to classics adaptation, directors always have to make a choice about which sentence to keep, which characters to focus on, which themes to emphasize. So I don't believe that this is an exclusive harm from our side. Second, the opposition assumes that there is a one fixed correct meaning that can be perfectly preserved, but literature has never worked that way because different readers already interpret the same novel differently based on culture, age, experiences, historical context. We believe that experimental adaptations simply make that interpretation explicit, and even if these experimental adaptations are viewed and are produced, many other people will watch this and have different meaning and feel differently. So I guess Elo have viewed Romeo and Juliet just as romantic story with the experimental adaptation. However, we believe that there are going to be many other people viewing different things from a same novel. Then thirdly, on political incentives changing the message. Yes, we believe that creators may intentionally shift messages, but this is not unique to our side either, because faithful adaptations are also made by people with incentives. Profit incentive, culture incentive, political incentives, even choosing what not to show is already a political decision. The difference is that our side openly invites reinterpretation, and we openly discourse that our adaptation is experimental adaptation, and the audiences will be notified of this and recognize these changes. However, their side, on the other hand, is very likely that it will going to be in secretly, and the audiences might not recognize this, which is far more harmful than our side. This shows that some messages shifts are actually valuable because society changes. I'll take the POI.
What interpretation of Animal Farm was preserved in the 2026 adaptation?
I'm sorry, I never watched Animal Farm adaptation, but it's very likely that they'll also have to include the core messages of Animal Farm. This is because these directors also have the incentive to keep the original readers of Animal Farm. If they did not keep the core messages of Animal Farm, there will be no readers, no audiences that are going to watch these movies, and that is the reason why they still have the incentive, because they want profit, they want followers, they want people who value and judge these production in a positive way. We say that if a classic contains a sexist or racist assumption, we should not automatically preserve them simply because they're old. We should preserve the core value while adapting surrounding messages for modern audiences. For example, the emotional core of a story, love, ambition, loneliness, injustice, can remain intact while the social framing changes. We preserve the spirit rather than the exact packaging. Then, moving on to weighing, opposition protects historical accuracy and all these small details about these classical novels. However, we protect continued relevance. A perfectly preserved message has very little value if future generations stop engaging with it entirely. Moving on to our last argument about how we preserve classics better than the opposition. The opposition desperately wants to preserve classics, but preservation is not merely keeping the text unchanged. Preservation means ensuring that people continue to understand and care about the issues and the ideas inside those works. First layer of mechanism. Classics became classics because they reflected the world around them. The fundamental reason classics became influential was because they successfully captured the concerns, emotion, and realities of the people living at that time. Many classics contain incredibly meaningful messages. For example, To Kill a Mockingbird discusses prejudice and justice. justice. Pride and Prejudice critiques marriage, expectation, and social classes. But if these classics remain frozen exactly where they were written, perhaps like in the 1700s or 1800s, the surrounding elements begin to overpower the message itself. Modern audiences may focus on, first, outdated gender roles, second, racial assumption, third, language that feels inaccessible, or fourth, social norms that feel offensive. The original meaning becomes harder to see because audience first react to the barriers around it. Second layer of mechanism, the purpose of preservation is transmission. Ideas only survive when people understand them. What do I mean by this? For younger audiences today, Shakespearean language can be difficult to understand, historical contexts feel distant, and offensive elements create discomfort. As a result, people often avoid engaging with classics entirely, see them as irrelevant, or reject them before reaching the core message. Ironically, the opposition's world reduced the number of people willing to engage with the classics they claim to protect. Our world recognized that to preserve meaning, you sometimes need to change form. By making modern tweaks, for example, audience better understand the emotional messages, stories became more accessible, no thank you, people can connect their own experiences to the themes. More importantly, we can communicate messages that are meaningful for the current generation without both sides want to do so, and preserving ideas matter more because books survive when people continue to care about them rather than just keeping its own form. And note how they never rebut to our second argument about giving more opportunity for minority community actors. Note how many actors that we know in Hollywood are white American. But note how there are many other people who want the chances of Hollywood actors. For example, Native American, Hispanic, Asian, Black. There are many other people who can be the best actor. However, just because classics are many characters in classic novels and many novels that are existing in the society are having white characters, that is the reason why these actors do not really have a lot of opportunity to shine. The reason why this is important, why this is very big impact in the society, is because minority really depends on representation. What do I mean by this? Representation is very important for minorities because they become the role model, they become the hope, and also they become the voice for the society. When these individuals voice out to the society, that is when a lot of people are going to listen because they're the famous actors. This is a reason why our second argument matters. Please respond. Proud to propose.
From 1A, the opposition has highly misunderstood classics and has completely misinterpreted the characterization of such literary works. What are actually classics? Firstly, we know that they are highly timeless. We gave this to you at first. Secondly, we must also note that they are highly popular books. They are classics because they are world-renowned, because they are known by a lot of people, they have been read by a lot of people, and thus adaptation is profitable and is desirable for commercial studios because there's money that can be made from it. Now, in this debate, what we ultimately need to prove as the opposition is that the meaning of classics should be preserved, and such minor alterations will completely destroy the original messaging and create more harm. Furthermore, the side government must prove that the adaptations will either, one, benefit marginalized communities to an extent which exceeds the harm which is created by the destruction of meaning, or two, they must also defend the claim that the publicity gained from such experimental adaptations won't damage the reputation of the classics in the first place. On the first issue, by the end of this, you'll believe why original meanings should be preserved. The claim made by side government here is that discrimination and stereotypes should be removed to avoid being offensive in modern context. Firstly, why is such discrimination and stereotypes actually necessary? We see that they are extremely important in creating the shock factor associated with these classics, right? We see that through the theme of racism in To Kill a Mockingbird, it is able to better deliver the message of empathy. Ultimately, when you remove these factors, these classics become very PG. They are unable to appeal to anyone. They are unable to change people's minds. It's unable to create political discussion simply because it's not provocative enough. The nature of these classics is that they are provocative. They're intentionally provocative in the period that they were created because the intention was to create social discourse, to create discussion surrounding these highly problematic and provocative political ideas. Secondly, the problem with this is that it completely neglects the historical pretext of these classics. classics. We argue here that the historical pretext of these classics is essential for the meaning itself. People need to understand the history behind the classics, the history of such time periods, to better understand the themes presented. We see that a complete understanding should be the ultimate goal here, and all the benefits claimed by side government surrounding publicity are completely lost if positive benefits are unable to be ensued as a result. Thirdly, we note here that the timelessness of classics makes it highly applicable to all time periods. The degree of inappropriateness is rarely ever exceeds that or other than creating significant emotional shock and dramatic effects. We see that there's highly unlikely that classics delivered through their original means will create public discourse to the extent presented by side government, because firstly, these classics aren't cancelled and they still exist. No, thank you. And secondly, because they are still taught in schools, they are still taught to the majority of society in their original form, even as a novel. So therefore, their message is not damaging to the extent that it completely discriminates and completely and harms specific groups to the extent that is described by SideGov. Now, yes, I'll take you now.
Do you think the message of To Kill a Mockingbird is racism in one specific town and one specific time, or prejudice itself? If it's the latter, why can't future generations reinterpret it through problems they actually experience nowadays?
We see that the relevance behind racism is still highly prevalent, and it helps deliver the theme of the message, which is empathy and messages against prejudice. I'll discuss this more in depth later. Now, what we weigh this here on magnitude, right? We see that the minimal harm of these classics offending people does not outweigh the societal benefit which is gained through the political discussions on these classics themselves. It does not outweigh the benefit which is derived from society being aware of these classics, because at the end of the day, you want to create attention surrounding a book like To Kill a Mockingbird because the message is so important. Now, what happens to these films itself beyond once it becomes PG to the extent that Gov proposes? Firstly, we see that it becomes very dull. When it becomes very, very dull, people won't engage with it at all. It is not entertaining for them to watch as a general audience, and it also goes against the views of the people who have read the book in the first place. Therefore, people won't engage with the film, and furthermore, people who haven't read the classic in the first place will not engage with the novel simply because the film has tainted the reputation. Now, we weigh this here very highly because there's a unique harm which arises on SideGov, the unique harm on damaging the writer's legacy. We see that this is unique to our side and should be awarded automatically because the preservation of the legacy of the writer is highly important. Now, the side government also attempts to symmetricize commercial interests. Why is this completely untrue? Firstly, we see that under our world, the fear of backlash will simply exceed any commercial desire to modify the film to the extent. The social disacceptance of such experimental adaptation will mean that these commercial studios will not be modifying the films to a great extent. So therefore, the original meaning will be preserved. Symmetricization is completely unrealistic. We give the example of Animal Farm, the current adaptation here. There's fart jokes. There's Old MacDonald had a farm references. The original meaning is completely lost. This cannot be accepted. They also made a claim on the increase of popularity. Firstly, we note here, an increase in popularity is not important if the value of the classic is lost. You don't want to popularize something that isn't important. Secondly, we see that popularization won't occur simply because the classics become dull and no one will want to read it in the first place. Second issue, by the end of this, you'll believe why experimental adaptations damage publicity to an extent which completely removes the interest of new individuals to read the classics. The claim here made by side government is that a space is created for marginalized communities. Now, I'll rebut this and then I'll provide a better alternative to solve this goal that side government proposes. Firstly, it goes against the intended purpose of the classics. These classics were not intended to forward the messages of these marginalized communities. Therefore, no matter how much you adapt it, it will not perfectly reflect the messages of these communities. Obviously, you cannot adapt a classic to deliver a message that it didn't intend on delivering in the first place. And instead, all you get is the harm of losing original meaning. This is the only harm here. Furthermore, addressing the opposition's point of castings, all it does is lead to reputational harm. Now, at best, their point gains no ground. This is because new works can be created anyways, and these works will be much, much better. We see that if you create a new work for marginalized communities, which they deserve, it will always deliver a better message, and it always creates more meaning than the classics adaptation ever could. We weigh this on vulnerability. These marginalized actors, these marginalized communities, they deserve their own films. They deserve their own unique attention. They deserve this through their own unique films which are created, which are highly relevant to the current time period. Fourthly, if you didn't believe any of that, there's no incentive for commercial studios to do adaptations which support marginalized communities anyways, because there's no profitability there. And ultimately, what film studios want to do is make the most profit. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we're the side that preserves the meaning of original classics, and we're the side that delivers the best results for these vulnerable groups, proud to oppose.
Just because a value existed in the past doesn't mean it deserves to be preserved in the present. Adaptation should carry forward the good in these stories, not the prejudices embedded within them that is offensive to underserved communities. So proud to stand on the proposition side of today's motion. As a roadmap on my speech, I'll be bringing up 3 key clash points of today's debate. First, on the effects to society. Second, on who better serves marginalized communities. Third, on who better preserves and advances classical literature, introducing the reasons as to why your ballot should go to side proposition. With that being said, our first clash point is on the effects to society, where we'll be looking into societal values, how societal values will change after the reinforcement of adaptations. We tell you through our first argument that if we don't participate in literary adaptations in pursuit of preservations, we are setting a culture that normalizes racism and sexism because literary works in the past include elements that are derogatory to underserved communities. We give you examples such as the film Dumbo made by Disney, where the film exaggerates behavior of crows, which stereotypes African Americans as well as Jim Crow laws. If we include these racist aspects when recreating Dumbo, we see 2 key impacts. Firstly, including racist elements sets a wrong message to society that it is okay to say derogatory remarks and normalize racism. This affects society as a whole, as we are creating a wrong culture within our society, but also affects young children whom groomed to watch these films and reading novels and are highly malleable. But secondly, people will boycott these new recreations of Dumbo as it includes racist elements causing an economic loss to the film companies. Another example of stories is Snow White and Cinderella, where the male character is a hero and portrays females as someone needing the saving of a male. Side opposition tries to respond to this by saying that directors change that movies change significantly more than just racial stereotypes. However, 3 issues here. 1. Experimental adaptations do not require changing the entire storyline. Directors want to preserve the most important message or aspects of the original film because the purpose of a recreation is to create a better version that is appropriate for a newer audience, not to create an entirely new film that you cannot recognize the original classic. Secondly, opposition misunderstands our burden. We're not arguing that every aspect of a classic must be rewritten. Rather, we believe that elements which we now recognize as harmful should not be normalized through repeated reproduction. Preserving prejudice for the sake of preservation is not a virtue that we support. Thirdly, they oversimplify the effects of racist remarks made in Hollywood films. Malleable children and society as a whole is affected by narratives that is
Point
put
of
into
information.
society, and this affects underserved communities. Before moving on to our second clash point, I'll take your point.
Should all Hollywood films deemed as culturally inappropriate in the modern era be removed from existence?
Well, we're not saying that what's existing should be removed. What we're saying is that if we're recreating it and we know that racism is wrong, we should obviously take that part out when we're recreating that film. So moving on to our second clash point. Our second clash point is regards to who better serves marginalized communities. We tell you through our second argument that the purpose of a recreation is to recreate a pre-existing novel. That is the purpose of recreation in the first place. We tell you is that by making modern tweaks to the original novel or film, we can include new perspectives and set a new narrative that supports underserved communities. These kinds of initiatives also leads to more opportunities for minority actors as more movies become a place that is more inclusive and representative. This directly clashes with side opposition's point on how changing the classics would mean less people will view because it is not provocative or leads to fun. However, we think that changing the classics actually leads to more learning and conversation. When films that went through adaptations come out, people will look into what have changed from the original film, sparking conversations and learning as people realize the harms of racism and sexism and how these things are unacceptable in our society. We also think their economic impact goes to our side because if movies included derogatory and racist elements, people would boycott these films, leading to economic harm to movie companies, which means they're not actually saving the movie companies from economic harm, they're actually leading to it. We outweigh and break this clash because we win in both economics and magnitude, as we're the side that protects minority communities by giving them opportunities and stopping the harmful narrative. The third and final clash point in today's debate is on who better preserves and advances classical literature. We tell you through a third argument that classical novels have historical context and language that is hard for the newer generation to understand. We think that our side is the side that better preserves the core message of classical literature and more
Point of
effectively helps the
information.
newer generation understand the plot and message. Before I further explain, I'll take your point.
Is altering word choice experimental adaptation?
Yeah, so I will talk about that as I continue. So we give you the example of Shakespearean language. Changing the Shakespearean language or tweaking it into a modern way is seen as experimental adaptation. These changes in the story for modern tweaks can actually increase the curiosity and understanding of the viewers. Don't let them say that these modern tweaks aren't actual adaptations because even if we concede that language is an adaptation, there are still modern ways to tweak the old Shakespearean language or the Shakespearean plays to better help the understanding of modern viewers, which they never respond to. So this argument directly clashes with side opposition's argument that talks about how new movies like Animal Farm that went through experimental adaptations are boring. However, this argument goes through a logical fallacy. Just because a movie went through an adaptation doesn't mean it's 100% boring. It depends on the individual, and the entertainment of the movie depends on the quality of the adaptation, not necessarily the amount of adaptation. What matters is quality of the new film, not the quantity or the amount of the original book that got cut out. We break this clash because side opposition never respond as to why making modern tweaks to the book will help the understanding of the newer generation. We think that a new audience requires a new and more appropriate narrative. At the end of the day, side opposition's best case is that people watch movies less and cause economic harm, and that original classics are being misrepresented. However, as we have acknowledged, if many people already read the classics, we do not need the same message as the adaptation. What we need is a modern tweak. So while that is their best case, our best case is that we protect the overall narrative of the society and send a message that sexism and racism isn't okay. We also protect the companies from boycotting, and which means we have a bigger impact of overall society and underrepresented communities and the economy. So for all these reasons, so proud to propose.
Two things in this speech. Firstly, I'll prove why none of Gov's contentions stand at the end of this debate. Then I'll prove why we clearly win on the clash of preserving meaning. On Ops claims, they have roughly 4 claims here. Their first claim is that these non-modernized texts carry on regressive norms. I have 2 responses. Firstly, as we've told you down the bench, these regressive norms are often central parts of the narrative that cannot be eliminated. For instance, the very examples they give you, the damsel in distress, native tribes in Pocahontas, they are central elements of the narrative that aren't removed. For instance, just look at the status quo. All Disney movies still have saving princesses. We hardly see why there's a comparative difference. But secondly, let's accept this to be true. People will still hardly internalize these harmful beliefs. Why is this? The world is liberal and will get increasingly more progressive over time. People are aware that these beliefs are wrong and regressive. For instance, racism will get portrayed by things like media and critics as regressive. Your parents tell you that these are bad beliefs. And we think that this actually helps our side of the case because the exposure of these harmful norms is not in itself bad because you're not endorsing them. It generates awareness that these norms are helpful and can be reinterpreted. For instance, the damsel can be seen as a symbol of ongoing feminist oppression that generates awareness and discourse about continuing female oppression. We think that the exposure of these norms is actually good for discourse and encourages discussion in a way that's good for creating social change. Even if we accept their point on regressive norms to be true. This is only one film that is reinterpreted, and we think it will hardly shape your beliefs for the very reason that it's 2 hours of runtime, and these beliefs are very subtle and pernicious and not at all very explicit, which means that people likely do not interpret it. Even if this point is true, it has very little impact. Their second push, you can read original novels. A few responses, but the main one, as we've passed you down the bench, is that people are far more likely to watch the adaptation, and the adaptation caters to a specific audience. Why is this? Firstly, these new adaptations are far more accessible. For instance, you can just go to the cinema. Secondly, they are more mainstream. For instance, it's a film you can view on Netflix. You can view with your friends. But thirdly, uniquely, classics tend to be quite dense. They're written in Old English. They are long novellas, etc. Which means these adaptations are the most accessible and target a different audience. Which is why most people can't just read the novel after they've read the film. No, they cater to different audiences, which necessitates that you preserve the original meaning, as I'll prove later. The third claim, then, modernization is required to make the meaning relevant and understandable. I have four responses to this. Firstly, the first thing to say is that these classics have a universal, timeless message. The reason they are considered classics is due to their longevity. For instance, feminist literature, Animal Farm, which is message about like state oppression and corruption is still very much and can still very much be applied to current contexts, for instance, neo-fascism, and we think that these universal messages are likely to persist. Secondly, classics are rare. Their message is rare, but you can have, no thank you, modernization separately from these classics. Most films aren't experimental adaptations, and they still carry the modern values that Prop wants to champion. So it's unclear if there's so many modern films right now, why you need more relevant values in comparison to these old values, which have unique harm and a unique benefit in society. Thirdly, true to novel texts don't need to follow the text line by line. Like obviously, you're going to reinterpret Shakespearean English into real English. Translating a language does not count as does not count as as what Gov wants to try to claim it as. I'll take you later. And we think that this means that you can still preserve the characters and plot while making the text more accessible by translating Old English into current English and into a format which people can understand, which means that you still can have very much understandable things on the outside of the house. I'll take you now.
If the messages are timeless, what's so wrong about changing the time frame and setting so that it matches the modern world and help people better understand?
We've already passed you this down the bench, and I'll go into it later in my speech. But the point is that film studios aren't unbiased. They're likely to warp the message in a way that dilutes the original message and makes it far worse. The last thing to say on understandability is that you still have visual cues and filmmaking techniques which can still make the plot very understandable, because you can still have even if dialogue is not very accessible, you can still have accessible film techniques. You can have excessive audio. You can have accessible you can have accessible visual imagery. The last thing to say is Gov's claim on minorities. I have two responses to this. Firstly, you can still cast minorities outside of classics adaptations, and given that classics adaptations are a very small minority of the filmmaking industry, it's unclear why you specifically need minority casting in this. But secondly, you can still have minority casting even if it becomes true to text, because obviously there's no requirement for the text that you need literal casting of race. Obviously, you can still have minority casting in this. There was no reason why you couldn't have. Then, why do we clearly win this debate? We give you two reasons from the start of a first and second as to why classics are extremely valuable yet extremely rare. Why are they valuable? Firstly, they're regarded as classics simply because they're relevant and have a universal message. But secondly, authors wrote not for profit but for message and passion. Take a look at George Orwell. Take a look at Shakespeare. Take a look at feminist writers such as Jane Austen. They all wrote to get them spread their message in comparison to the profit-seeking incentives of firms. Why then do film and production studios taint this message? Two reasons. Firstly, commercialization. Studios must make film mainstream and appeal to a wider audience who crave action and quick dopamine hits. However, classics often use drawn-out pacing since there's a focus on the message, which creates an inherent tension, and the way this tension is resolved is that studios add action and tension, diluting the core message and storytelling techniques. This responds to your POI, by the way. Secondly, they have an incentive for their film to stand out, which creates another incentive to warp the message. But thirdly, there's depoliticization. Shows don't want to be partisan and get cancelled, which is why things that carry political messages, such as Animal Farm, probably do get diluted. The op has two responses to this. Firstly, they say this is not an exclusive harm. Directors can still make creative decisions, but we think that the very direct-to-text nature of this means that there's very little space for creators to warp the message. The second response is that there's lots of interpretations in these films. But yes, a true-to-text is precisely the thing that keeps open these different interpretations. Your side, when you have a director that's choosing and interpreting these texts and making a new one, warps the meaning, where the director changes the meaning to what they think the plot should be. That your side is the one that forces a meaning on these texts. What's the impact of this? You lose meaning, you lose wisdom, you lose political knowledge and moral concepts, for instance, the ones in Frankenstein, and simply weigh this, right? But firstly, idea preservation has an extremely high intensity. So in society, political concepts get revived. This is a huge difference. It leads to more scrutiny on things like corrupt political administrations. But uniquely, it also affects a lot of people because this message spreads to a lot of people, which is the precise reason why it creates a lot of transformative and positive social change. And that's precisely the reason why we win this debate.
Prop had one path to victory in this debate, but it's incredibly unclear on how it actually works. This was on benefits to minorities. Why did they fail their burden here? They had two pushes. Firstly, on protecting minorities from harmful stereotypes. We told you all down the bench that protecting minorities came in the form of stripping the book of its meaning. That looked like removing like a part of like indigenous culture from like Pocahontas. That looked all of those examples, right? If you didn't believe any of this, you should then understand that this is still a wash because obviously racism in a movie doesn't make people racist. The harms that they actually claim to activate here are probably like as like limited to like maybe a few people watch it and are like, I don't like appreciate that portrayal, which happens in pretty much every single piece of media ever, right? So we think that their harms there were like incredibly minor, if any at all, and you should weigh them out. They probably fall out of this debate. Their second push was on promoting minorities in white roles. But why is that? Why does not only their burden fail here, but why is this actually an active harm on their side? Observe that having a minority character in a white role does nothing to promote minorities in Hollywood when you reduce them to being in white roles. That what this means is that when we observe that pressure on studios to approve projects with meaningfully ethnic characters or whose characters actually revolve around them being ethnic instead of just being Black Little Mermaid is gets significantly smaller when you have checked the box for trying to appeal to minorities in the public eye. So what this actually did on side proposition was it meant that you were less likely to have meaningfully ethnic characters. It meant that you were not only it meant that not only was this not a path to victory for them, but it meant that we flipped this on side opposition. It meant that you were less. It meant that even though you may have like more more ethnic character is in white roles, which might benefit maybe a few actors, you do nothing for minorities as a whole because you severely limit the amount of projects which actually promote minorities. So, because they fail their only path to victory, as long as there is no remaining active harm on our side, their mitigation should do nothing for them to win this debate, and you should award this debate on that alone. So, how does our path to victory still stand? We had three things, and they all revolved around maintaining the original message. The first thing was that you maintained discourse and multiple interpretations, because obviously when you are maintaining the original integrity, original time frame, original characters, ethnicities and everything of the characters in the book, what you are going to do is you're going to maintain the discourse and interpretations that the original novel had, right? Because you do not like shift things too far away from what was the original. You do not shift things from like genres or anything. The second thing here is that you do not sterilize or depoliticize the work. We in a POY, I asked about what interpretation remains in 2026's adaptation of Animal Farm. Animal Farm ends in a breakdance scene where all the characters sing and dance to a hip hop EDM version of Old MacDonald Had a Farm. I think that says enough. The third thing that we pushed you here is that the directors simply have an incentive to just change the genre, tone, or message of the book to make it distinct because they want to stand apart from the work they do not want to be defined by the classics. They want to define the classics. The impact of this was incredibly simple but very grounded compared to anything that prop tries to claim. It was that you get people to meaningfully and critically engage with works which they would not otherwise, which led them to be more informed, more well-rounded and better people. Compare this to their only claim, which we would weigh off in their best world, which is maybe that like you get a few more ethnic actors in Hollywood, and like maybe you like have three people watch a movie and get offended. We thought we would weigh that off even in their best world. It's incredibly unclear how proposition wins the debate. Never been prouder to oppose.
Judge, what the opposition is missing in this debate is that a true-to-novel adaptation are also produced by profit-based production companies. And the difference is that our side audiences are aware of the risk of the new interpretations. Note how they still did not rebut our argument about the opportunity for minority community actors and the representations they bring. They also had a contradiction because in the beginning, they said that many people already know and read the classics, but then they moved on and then they said that people do not even read, so the adaptations are the only source. If the original sources are the only ones that are available, we do not see a problem with new interpretations. Now, we are going to move on to 4 of the main clashes, which is number 1, what does true to novel even mean? Just like our Deputy Prime Minister has stated, literature does not have an answer. There are many people that will think differently even though they read the same book. There are also many authors that did not explain what every single detail and every single message in their novels mean. Therefore, even if we were to create a true to novel adaptation, there may be different views and details within the films because they are created by different directors, and all these different directors have their own beliefs and own ideas. For example, let's take a look at a high school English class because we've all been through that, right? So if just because the teacher makes us read Romeo and Juliet, that does not mean everyone thinks the same thing at the same time. They do not only think that it has one theme at one scene. Some may think that it is about forbidden love. Others might think that it is about the division of classes, and there might be others that think about how fate changes the actual lives of people. So proud to propose. Now moving on to my second clash, which is how should you preserve a classical novel? The opposition continues to argue that a core message is important in the classical novel. We also very much agree. We agree that the core message is very important, and we are very, very willing to preserve that. Making a new experimental adaptation, film or audio or whatever, does not mean that we will be making something entirely new with the goal of erasing the original novel. What we are saying is that we are going to make modern tweaks so that the people that will watch it will not be offended. And the government side fails to understand why offensive language, prejudice, and stereotypes is part of a core message, or what part of changing the language for modern people to understand is wrong. The government side does not believe that by removing these offensive terms or prejudice or statements made by the characters that are stereotypical will change the entire core message of the novel. Thus, we win on the point of preservation of a classical novel, as we are the side that helps the modern audience understand the true meaning of the novel. And the last clash is the entrance of the audience. The opposition continued to state that the adaptations will be dull and no one will ever want to read the original work. However, isn't that just an assumption made by the opposition? Just like our previous speakers has continuously stated, the amount of adaptations does not automatically change the entire enjoyment of the adaptation. Everyone has different views and different perspectives and different background knowledge. So while some people may think that the adaptations to some novels are enjoyable, there may be actually some people that read the actual OG novel, like Romeo and Juliet, and they might think, wow, that was like the worst novel that I've ever read in my life. So if they want to read or watch the original work, then they can read or watch the original work. And if they want to watch the different adaptations or listen to it, then they can. What we are doing is we are providing different choices, and literature does not have an answer. Just like everyone's taste and everyone's joy does not have an answer as well. Lastly, we outweigh on the weighing of the side opposition. Side opposition weighed on meaning. However, like our third argument states, we are the side that truly preserves and communicates the most important message of the original film. The meaning of the classics do not get an impact unless the viewers understand. So we are the side that helps the meaning get communicated. So proud to affirm. Thank you.